Good evening and welcome to Strategic Layer. Tonight, we examine a development in the economic dimension of the Russia Ukraine conflict that has profound implications for international finance, European unity, and the future of global reserve systems. This is a story about unintended consequences, strategic miscalculation, and how financial warfare operates in ways that differ fundamentally from conventional military operations. Let's begin with what actually occurred and why it matters. In May 2024, the European Union made a decision that appeared reasonable from a certain perspective. Rather than seizing the principal amount of frozen Russian sovereign reserves, European officials decided to confiscate the interest earnings generated by these frozen assets. This amounted to approximately $3 billion annually that would be transferred to support Ukraine. From the European Union's viewpoint, this approach offered several perceived advantages. It would provide substantial financial support to Ukraine without requiring additional appropriations from European national budgets. It would maintain some degree of legal distinction between seizing principal versus collecting interest. And it would demonstrate resolve in opposing Russian actions while theoretically avoiding the more controversial step of outright confiscation of sovereign reserves. European policymakers believed this represented a measured approach that balanced support for Ukraine with respect for certain financial and legal principles. The decision was presented as a way to make Russia pay for the conflict while maintaining Europe's position as a stable financial jurisdiction. However, this decision contained a fundamental miscalculation about how financial warfare actually operates and what tools are available to those targeted by such measures. Within 72 hours of the European Union's announcement, Moscow issued a decree outlining its response. This response was not emotional or reactive. It was precise, measured, and strategically designed to create maximum pressure on European decision-makers. The Russian government announced that for every euro Europe seized from Russian assets, Russia would seize equivalent value from European corporate holdings operating within Russian territory. This was not a threat to nationalize all foreign assets indiscriminately. It was a promise of surgical, proportional retaliation calibrated exactly to match European actions. The Russian position established perfect symmetry. They announced intentions to seize exactly $15 billion in value, representing the accumulated frozen assets plus interest. The symmetry of this response makes it difficult for European officials to characterize Russian actions as disproportionate or aggressive, since Moscow is explicitly matching European measures. To understand why this response creates such significant pressure, we must examine the scale of European corporate presence in Russia. Major European corporations maintain substantial operations across various sectors of the Russian economy. Volkswagen maintains approximately $3.5 billion in Russian operations, including manufacturing facilities, supply chain relationships, and dealership networks. Raiffeisen Bank has roughly $2.8 billion in Russian assets and operations. Danone maintains about $1.2 billion in Russian business activities. Additional major European corporations with significant Russian exposure include Shell, BP, Société Générale, and Unilever. When totaled, European corporate exposure in Russia exceeds $200 billion across all sectors and companies. The critical point is that Russia does not need to seize all of this exposure to achieve its strategic objective. They only need to seize $15 billion to match precisely what Europe has taken. And Russian officials can be highly selective about which companies and sectors to target for maximum political effect within Europe. What makes this response particularly effective from a strategic perspective is that Russia is not directly attacking European governments. Instead, Russian actions target European corporations, which then create pressure on their own governments. These corporations now face a choice: accept losses of Russian operations worth billions, or pressure their governments to reverse the asset seizure policy. Many of these companies are now actively lobbying European capitals, demanding compensation, seeking deals, or calling for policy reversal. This creates a fundamentally different political dynamic than government-to-government conflict. When governments seize sovereign assets, the cost is primarily political and diplomatic. But when Russia seizes corporate assets, the cost becomes economic and domestic. Economic losses create immediate constituencies: shareholders who see asset values decline, workers whose employment depends on these operations, suppliers whose contracts are threatened, and entire regions whose economies are tied to these corporate activities. Volkswagen employs approximately 40,000 people in Germany whose work is connected to Russian operations. Raiffeisen Bank has investors throughout Austria. Danone operates factories in France that depend on broader corporate health. These are not abstract financial figures. These represent real people facing tangible economic consequences, and those people are beginning to question why their livelihoods are being sacrificed. Behind closed doors, according to sources familiar with the deliberations, European Commission officials are engaged in intensive discussions about how to address this situation. European representatives have reportedly attempted to negotiate with Moscow, seeking compromises or mechanisms to reverse the seizure without appearing to back down. However, the Russian position remains consistent. You seized $15 billion of our assets. We will seize $15 billion of your corporate holdings. When you return our assets, we will return yours. This is presented as perfect equivalence, with no room for negotiation or middle ground compromise. This places European leadership in an extremely difficult position. If they reverse the asset seizure, they appear weak, Ukraine loses a significant funding source, and the entire sanctions architecture appears less credible. But if they maintain the seizure, European corporations bear the cost, jobs are lost, and domestic political support for Ukraine-related policies potentially erodes. This represents the trap that European officials may not have fully anticipated when making the initial decision. What appeared to be a way to punish Russia without direct cost has instead given Moscow leverage over European domestic politics through the mechanism of corporate pressure. Beyond the immediate bilateral confrontation between Europe and Russia, this situation carries far-reaching implications for the global financial system that extend well beyond the $15 billion in question. Central banks and reserve managers around the world are closely observing these developments. The fundamental question being asked in capitals across Asia, Africa, and Latin America is straightforward. If European jurisdictions can seize Russian interest payments for political reasons, could they seize ours under different circumstances? This question strikes at the foundation of the global reserve system. For decades, central banks have held substantial reserves in Western currencies and Western financial centers based on the assumption that property rights in these jurisdictions were absolute and not subject to political considerations. The European decision, regardless of its justification, has demonstrated that under certain circumstances, property rights can be overridden for geopolitical purposes. Once that precedent is established, the perception of safety changes fundamentally. According to conversations with reserve managers from multiple emerging market economies, many are reassessing their reserve allocation strategies. The options being discussed include reducing holdings of Western sovereign bonds, increasing gold purchases, negotiating bilateral currency swap arrangements, and building payment infrastructure that operates independently of Western banking systems. One central bank official from an Asian country stated that for 50 years his institution parked reserves in European financial centers because they were considered safe and predictable. Now, that assumption is being reconsidered. Alternative reserve locations being discussed include Singapore, Dubai, and increased gold holdings. This represents a cost that may dwarf the $3 billion annually that Europe is collecting from Russian asset interest. If central banks globally reduce their Western reserve holdings by even a small percentage, the resulting capital reallocation would measure in the trillions of dollars. At the heart of this issue lies a fundamental question about the role of financial centers in the global economy. European officials would argue that their actions are justified by international law principles, the need to support Ukraine, and the imperative to demonstrate that aggression carries consequences. These are legitimate policy arguments. However, they exist in tension with another role that European financial centers have traditionally played, that of neutral, predictable jurisdictions where property rights are respected regardless of political circumstances. The challenge is that these two roles are fundamentally incompatible. Once a financial center weaponizes its position for political purposes, it ceases to be neutral. And once neutrality is compromised, the calculation changes for anyone deciding where to hold assets. This is not fundamentally a moral question. It is a question of incentive structures and rational decision-making under uncertainty. If property rights in a jurisdiction are conditional rather than absolute, rational actors will seek alternative jurisdictions or alternative assets. Russia's response demonstrates understanding of this dynamic. Their measured, proportional retaliation is designed to prove several points: that European actions carry costs, that financial warfare operates in both directions, and that European unity may be more fragile than it appears. The effectiveness of the Russian strategy is visible in the growing divisions within Europe itself. Member states that were initially hesitant about the asset seizure are now pointing to the corporate consequences as validation of their concerns. Countries whose major corporations are being targeted are demanding that their governments negotiate solutions. Countries that remained neutral are observing the situation with a degree of satisfaction that they avoided involvement. Belgium presents a particularly interesting case. As host to Euroclear, the clearinghouse where most frozen Russian reserves are held, Belgium found itself with responsibilities it never sought. According to Belgian finance officials, Belgium argued against the seizure policy, warning about potential liabilities, but was overruled by larger member states. Now, Belgium finds itself caught between Russian demands regarding frozen assets and European corporate concerns about Russian retaliation, while bearing blame from multiple parties for a policy it opposed. This illustrates how the Russian response is not merely extracting economic costs, but actively dividing the European coalition. From a policy analysis perspective, European leadership faced alternative approaches to supporting Ukraine financially. The most straightforward would have been direct budgetary appropriations, raising taxes, cutting other spending, or increasing borrowing to fund Ukraine's support. This approach would have been transparent and sustainable. It would have required making the domestic political case for sacrifice, but it would have avoided the complications of seizing foreign assets and the precedents such actions establish. Instead, European officials chose what appeared to be a cost-free option, funding Ukraine with seized Russian assets. This seemed to offer financial support without domestic political costs or budget impacts. However, as events have demonstrated, there are no truly cost-free options in international finance. Russia's retaliation proves that what appeared to be someone else's money came with significant strings attached. Every euro taken from Russia has been matched by a euro taken from European corporations, transforming what looked like free funding into an expensive lesson in financial warfare dynamics. This situation reflects a broader pattern observable across international financial history. Powerful actors often assume their power is absolute, that they can modify rules without consequences, and that targets of their actions have no meaningful recourse. International institutions have made similar assumptions in various contexts. The result tends to be the creation of resistance mechanisms that ultimately undermine the original power projection. Russia's response follows this pattern. When faced with financial pressure, they identified vulnerabilities in European positions and exploited them effectively. The precedent being established extends beyond this specific bilateral confrontation. Other countries that have concerns about Western financial power are observing carefully. They note that Russia developed and implemented an effective countermeasure, that European corporations are suffering significant losses, and that European strategy appears to have backfired. This creates an invitation for others to contemplate similar resistance if they face comparable financial pressure. The precedent Europe established is not one of strength and deterrence, but one demonstrating that financial warfare creates vulnerabilities and invites retaliation. What we are witnessing is a case study in how financial warfare operates differently from conventional military conflict. European officials made a decision that seemed reasonable within a certain framework of analysis. However, they may have underestimated both Russia's capacity to respond effectively and the second-order consequences of weaponizing financial systems. The immediate confrontation involves $15 billion and the fate of European corporate operations in Russia. But the deeper implications concern the stability of the global reserve system, the credibility of Western financial centers as neutral jurisdictions, and the precedents being established for future financial conflicts. This is not about who struck first. It is about who can endure the counterstrike and what systemic changes result from the exchange. Currently, Russia is demonstrating capacity to impose significant costs on European corporations, while European unity shows signs of strain. The ultimate resolution remains uncertain, but what is clear is that financial warfare carries risks that may not be immediately apparent, that assumptions about one directional power projection can prove mistaken, and that in international finance, trust and credibility are valuable assets that, once damaged, are extremely difficult to restore. Thank you for watching Strategic Layer. We'll continue monitoring this developing situation and its implications for global finance. Please subscribe for continued analysis.